Welcome to the Better Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. It's Friday, December 21st. I'm Ciaran O'Connor.
And I'm John Wood Jr.
It's good, John.
What's cracking, Ciaran?
It's good to be with you.
Likewise, my brother. Absolutely.
So we got a whole lot of news today. Whole lot of news. But before we jump in, maybe we just give our listeners a little reintroduction to who we are and what we're trying to do here.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I guess I'll start it off. So who am I? Who
are you? Who are any of us?
Right? Yeah. Well, before we get too existential, my the thing that people know me from in politics prior to Better Angels was I was a nominee for Congress in 2014. I was a Republican nominee for Congress in the 43rd District of California, which is largely inner city Los Angeles. I ran against Maxine Waters, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, which was a lot of fun. You got all sorts of war stories from that.
We'll get into that someday.
Well, yeah, one of these days. Shout out to Maxine. I love you. No hard feelings at all. And I was after that vice chairman. Technically, I was second vice chairman of the Republican Party of Los Angeles County for about a year and a half following that campaign. And now I am director of media development for this prestigious organization that we love so much, Better Angels, and colleague of my good buddy here, Ciaran O'Connor. Go ahead and tell the people about yourself, bro.
Yes, sir. My name's Ciaran. I'm from New York. Moved to LA about a year ago, which is pretty wild. My background is on the blue team. First got involved in politics in 2008, volunteering for a man named Barack Obama.
I heard
Shouts Michelle, just finished her book. Then I worked on the re-election campaign in 2012, went back to school, got my degree, worked as a consultant for a while. Then I worked for Hillary in 2016, and after 2016, I got involved in Better Angels. For those who don't know, Better Angels, we are trying to bring red and blue, conservative and liberal together to see if we can't talk to one another, talk with one another, rather than simply talk at or about one another.
Not an easy thing to do sometimes.
Not an easy thing to do. And John and I obviously have our own disagreements, but we've become good friends, and we can talk politics. And I think maybe once in a while it's frustrating. I know I can get a little rant-like, bring some cynicism to the table occasionally, but Better Angels in a lot of ways is an antidote to cynicism. And what do you think? How have you felt about Better Angels?
Oh, man, well, it's been an amazing thing for me because my entree into politics, actually, my entree into politics was also on a working level sort of through Barack Obama's campaign. I was, I grew up thinking of myself more as a Democrat and a liberal, and through a series of events, which maybe on another episode we can talk about.
I would like to dive into your political history at some point.
Yeah, right. It's a little bit interesting and eclectic. Suffice it to say that obviously I experienced. I don't want to say I was red-pilled necessarily, but I did become more conservative about things over time. But I grew up as a great admirer and remain a great admirer of Martin Luther King Jr.'s, the idea that love is a transformative social value. And I looked at Obama's campaign in 2008 as a young person. The idea of hope and change is kind of echoing a lot of those sentiments. I wound up developing some criticisms and some frustrations of Obama as time went on, but I remain inspired by the example he set back then in terms of it just being unifying. And whether you're Democrat or Republican, whether you're talking about Obama or Reagan, I think that the greater statesmen in American history have been people who have highlighted our common values as opposed to just, obsessing about all the ways in which we're different. And the thing that's amazing about Better Angels in that context is that Better Angels is an organization which is building out an actual structured space and an infrastructure, really, for people to have these sorts of deeper conversations and dialogues all across the country. And, it's more than just it's more than just freewheeling dialogue. I mean, we are best known for our Red and Blue workshop, which is basically a day-long program that is based on a family therapy model where we take small groups of Reds and Blues, conservatives and liberals, and we bring them into a shared space where they don't debate politics, but they speak from the vantage point of what I guess you could call your own lived experience, so to speak.
Totally.
To show just sort of where they're coming from on a human level and to present a vision of themselves beyond the stereotypes and stigmas and characterizations and so forth. So, you'll learn more about Better Angels. We'll have a link in the description below, and we very much encourage people listening to come on board as a member if you're not one already. But this is part of the media effort to bring people together here too. So hopefully, Ciaran, you and I can set a good example and not strangle each other by the end of the conversation.
Totally. Yeah. Check us out, better-angels.org. We just launched a new website. It's pretty tight. So let's get into the news.
Yeah,
Looks
man,
like
a lot of that.
Over the past 48 hours, we have withdrawn we plan to withdraw our troops from Syria. We're cutting our troops in Afghanistan in half.
Yeah.
The Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, has resigned essentially in protest to President Trump. I think basically what he said was that, Mr. President, you deserve a Secretary of Defense whose views align more closely with yours, the subtext of which was, I have fundamental disagreements with you in terms of how we treat our allies and how we stand up to our foes.
It was a polite way of saying, I think what you're doing is a little bit crazy, Mr. President, and I can't come along for the ride.
Yes, and I think he had long sort of commanded the most bipartisan respect of any of the cabinet secretaries. And looks like the government might shut down pretty soon. Nice Christmas present for the people.
Yeah, well, that's what you don't want under the tree is a missing paycheck. Obviously, if you're a person who works for the federal government, whatnot. On the other hand, a lot of people were hoping that they could have a wall on the southern border for Christmas, or at least the funding for one, right? So it looks like nobody's going to get what they want at the current rate. What else is going on in the?
What else is going on?
We've got all sorts of Mueller investigation news, right? Or at least we did. It seems like that's old. That was like the beginning of the week's news, but
we've been trucking along. I think at least several dozen people have been indicted. Many of which obviously are Russian nationals, but we've got Trump's former campaign manager,
Paul Manafort.
We've got his former national security advisor,
General Flynn, Michael Flynn,
who I believe served for less than a month.
Yeah, he wasn't in there very
We've
long.
got Michael Cohen, the president's former personal lawyer. And we have some lower-level campaign staff. Rick Gates, maybe Roger Stone, not to speculate, Mr. Dirty Trickster.
Self-proclaimed dirty trickster. It's important to say Ciaran's not just throwing out ad hominems.
No, of course. I mean, he claims it with pride.
He's got a tattoo of Richard Nixon on his back.
He does, and shouts to his entire sartorial vibe. He's prone to wearing double-breasted suits. But, one interesting thing about the Trump era, regardless of how you feel about the politics, is just the cast of characters that have been elevated to, the highest levels of American life. I miss Sean Spicer, for example.
Yeah, and Sean Spicer, Omarosa Manigault, a lot of interesting characters, and from a TV sort of perspective, of course, from an entertainment value perspective, it's a great time for media, as much as people universally seem to revile the media. Ratings are up. I think CNN, the war with the White House has been great for CNN, hasn't it? From a ratings sort of standpoint.
Yes.
And,
yes.
But it's probably been good for MSNBC. And, I think I heard that Fox's ratings were not as high under Trump as maybe it had been previously. I'm not sure.
I think opposition, feeds viewership.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I think, and I think too, for me, there's always just this sort of, for me, just personally, there's this entertainment factor, and it's sort of like, they say, the term rubbernecking, when you're on the highway and there's an accident and everyone just kind of slows down to do a little gaping.
Exactly. Right.
So there's that, and for me, I also have to separate just sort of the more serious stuff. You know, I mean, I joked about Sean Spicer because he was hilarious, but you know, he's also representing the United States government and representing an administration, in my view, that's occasionally played fast and loose with the truth, to put it charitably.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to keep those two things in mind, because I think sometimes the entertainment factor is what contributes to the polarization in some ways, because people aren't paying attention seriously and thinking about how we can really come together. They're thinking about, this is hilarious, but sort of in a sick way.
Right. Well, you know, and I was going to get to that too. I mean, it's the spectacle of American politics today. Well, first of all, it is striking as a spectacle, right? And I would like to say, from my perspective, it's not just Trump. In fact, I think that Trump is more of a, you know, I mean, look, plenty of Republicans voted for Donald Trump and supported him and agree with, you know, many of his policies.
Most Republicans, I would say.
Oh, absolutely. Most Republicans, large majority of Republicans. In fact, I think Trump's approval rating among Republicans is still pretty high, although I don't know if any new polls have been taken after the pulling out in Syria and so forth.
I think there's a pretty significant floor.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Trump famously said, I could shoot someone on the street of Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose support.
Sure. And right. And it would be interesting to unpack some of the reasons for that. But I was just going to say, I mean, to your point, you know, you do have this big spectacle which sometimes obscures the seriousness of the issues, because for many people, and I think many people who just sort of troll folks on Twitter and you know, who are just kind of shouting at their radios and their TV, there's a mixture of genuine concern for the country, which motivates a lot of frustration, but then there's also just a team sports dynamic,
the horse race,
where, you know, I think that in a lot of our minds, whether we admit this to ourselves or not, I think a lot of us care more about beating the other guy than actually serving the interests of the country, objectively speaking.
No question.
Because I think that if we didn't have that attitude, then we would think more in terms of, okay, the other side is wrong, these other people are, you know, misguided in whatever way. How can I, at least on a citizen to citizen level, sort of help spread a little bit of light and wisdom? How can I better communicate with people who are completely sort of in the wrong on a certain issue? But yeah, I know. But I recognize that it does get tough. So, looking at what I was going to say a moment ago was that I see Trump as more of a symptom than a cause of a lot of our, you know,
kind of chicken or egg in a bit.
Well, look, I think that there is so right now, I think it feels like the chaos in Washington D.C. is just at an all-time high, right? And I mean, you know, at the moment, everybody in Washington is mad at the president, except for maybe Rand Paul or someone like that, which is interesting because Rand Paul is one of the first people to come out swinging against Trump.
Shouts Rand Paul. You know, do you remember, just a funny aside, when there was something where Rand Paul, you know, like punched his neighbor?
No, that wasn't what happened.
There was some kind of personal dispute.
He was attacked. Actually, this is good.
Oh, no, he was attacked.
He was attacked by his neighbor.
Strike that.
His neighbor broke a couple of his ribs. I don't know if he had a golf club or what, but...
And the funny thing was that Rand Paul's reaction was kind of like, this is a personal matter. This is not a man attacking a congressman. This is a personal matter between two men.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, hey, you know, he didn't try to capitalize on it, I guess.
I know. It's just, I want to know the real story there. Maybe it'll come out one day.
I'm kind of curious there, too. But, yeah, so, you know, all of this dysfunction in Washington and so forth. But the point that I would want to drive home, because, look, Donald Trump ran on a platform that had a lot of appeal for a lot of people. I think in part because you got a lot of Americans who feel like they were forgotten by the elites in Washington and Hollywood and in the tech sector and so forth. I saw some stats the other day that said that I think 72% of all the new jobs created over the course of the last however many years were created in the 53 top major metropolitan areas in the United States. I've also seen stats that say between 95 and 99% of all new jobs created under the Obama administration went to people with college education, right? So both of those statistics leave out the vast majority of people in rural America and so forth. Vast majority of, certainly a lot of, working class white folks and so on and so forth. And I don't want to racialize it too much because...
Well, I have a question on that because I think you hear this term a lot, economic anxiety as a explanation for the Trump phenomenon. And so I'd be curious, what do you think about economic anxiety versus racial resentment? And obviously the two overlap in a lot of complicated ways, but I think that's been a sort of divisive issue between not just people on the left and the right, but people in sort of the center left versus people on the more younger activist side. The latter really saying that racial resentment is the primary prism through which this should be seen. So I'd be curious, just as a conservative and also as a black man, what you think of that whole debate.
Yes, right. I'm demographically qualified to answer this pressing question. Actually, I appreciate how you framed it though, because I do think that there is something of a generational divide there. I think it is easier for younger people to look at the frustrations and say, well, this is all race-based, right?
Right.
Whereas a lot of older people, certainly on the left, feel that way too. But I think that older folks are also more likely to recognize the fact that it's like, well, no, there's some structural and some economic issues at play here. Obviously, I can't speak for everybody, but my sense is that, yes, I think that a lot of the cultural, you said they overlap, and I think that they do. A lot of the worry about immigration, a lot of the worry about outsourcing and the Chinese and so on and so forth can be tied directly to, or at least somewhat directly to, economic concerns. Now that, on a certain level, that seems like it doesn't make much sense because a lot of Trump voters are inland and so forth.
Right.
I mean, they're not necessarily in border states, although obviously Trump does have supporters in, border areas and so forth. But I think that there's just a larger sort of narrative sense, and I don't think it's without justification, honestly, that says that, look, opportunity and mobility have been diminishing in America, certainly for folks in the Rust Belt and folks in the rural areas and so on and so forth. And what they see from policymakers is a lot of emphasis on the importance of what to them sounds like, just opening up the borders, making an easier way for immigrants to come into our society and so forth. And a lot of concern over the rights of immigrants, over the treatment of immigrants and so on and so forth. And so even if folks coming into this country as immigrants, and obviously, what conservatives would tend to say would be, illegal immigration is the particular difficulty, because it's like these people aren't even supposed to be here in the first place, right? But I'm here with my kids, and our wages have been flat for all this time, and who's trying to help us out, right? There's this sense that the people who are in power just care a lot more about these other groups of people than they do about the folks who are here already, and so this sows the seeds for some friction. And then that's on the policy side, but on the cultural side, I think people look at Hollywood. I think people look at, the stories that come out in movies and cartoons even and so forth. And you just get a sense that, multicultural, the elite and modern American culture wants to see itself as colorful. It wants to see itself as multicultural, diverse in all of these different ways. And what it does not want to see itself as is like white, male, and uneducated, which is everything that a lot of Trump voters, are, at least in the eyes of both the political and the cultural elites on the left and so forth, and in the universities as well. So I think that a lot of the support for Trump was just a cultural backlash against all those forces, mixed with some very legitimate economic concerns. And I think that both of those things can tilt into some racial friction and look, you've got genuine racists, obviously, and that's its own sociological category here, I think. But I think it's way more complicated than just the Trump voters or racist sort of thing that I hear from some folks on the blue side. Yeah.
Totally. No, I think you hit the nuances pretty well. And it'd be interesting, we're going to have guests on, so it'd be interesting to maybe have on one of these writers who's written persuasively or eloquently about race as a primary driver of I'm thinking of Adam Serwer in specific at The Atlantic, and obviously Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I used to have Twitter. I actually deleted Twitter.
Oh, you got rid of your Twitter? Well, how are you gonna retweet the Better Angels podcast if you're not on Twitter?
To my 400 followers. Yeah, no, it's funny. People have always said to me, you should do Twitter. You should do Twitter. you're funny, you're engaging, and so I was always like, all right, I'll give Twitter a shot.
I actually just got into Twitter, really.
What? You like Twitter?
Well, now I do.
You're a beast on Twitter.
Well, now, kind of, but but when we met, I wasn't. I mean, I was on Twitter when I was running for Congress. People got on me all the time. Said, "Why aren't you doing more on Twitter?" Because I was silly me. I was knocking on doors in the neighborhood when really I should have just been tweeting. Trump style, I guess. Did
you ever have a debate with Maxine Waters?
I did. Do you want to get into that? Because that
well, let's save that for another day.
We'll definitely hear that story.
Well, why don't we shift gears a little bit and
but to tie it to the Washington thing. So let me just say this, and I'd like your take on it. So those are all my senses about why it is Trump voters supported Trump, and why it gets confused, or at least largely.
We got a little music outside.
We do have a little
marching
bit of
band
music outside. Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess we can.
It's Friday,
I guess we can treat that as theme music.
The weekend's
You
coming.
said we're in Culver City, California, right? Yeah, we are
in Culver City, California,
which is
beautiful town.
Which is where I grew up. One of the most multicultural places in America, actually. And so you never know what interesting musical sounds may drift through your window. But anyway, I think that the 2016 election was a story of people voting against each other rather than for something on both the left and the right.
Well, to some extent.
More than previous elections. But let me just put the cherry on it. And I think that explains a certain amount of the current chaos. I mean, just beyond whatever you think of Donald Trump as an administrator and so forth, the person capable.
Or role model for children.
Right, but I mean in terms of explling the chaos in Washington.
Right.
I think the fact that the tone has just been set for political warfare, for a long time in American politics, but in the last election in particular, that it was basically a cultural war election, sort of means that we've come to a place now where we are okay with a greater degree of chaos in our government, because that's our presupposition going into it. So that's just a general sense. But what do you think of my basic sort of feeling here? Does that resonate with you? You think?
Yeah, I think the chaos has been normalized, certainly to some extent.
Yeah.
I think people take for granted two things about Barack Obama, regardless of what you think of his politics. One is his ethics. I mean, I don't know if you can think of a single really major ethical scandal. I mean, the only two things I think that were really charged against him were the IRS thing and Fast and Furious and the DOJ.
Well,
Benghazi was cooked up a little bit.
Right.
But so just to say, I think
I'm not going to cut you off there, but those would be subjects that, from a red perspective, people would really want to say, no, Obama, Libya was a huge thing. The IRS was a huge thing. And it's complicated, right?
Well,
I don't want to take you off your course, though. Keep
totally.
making the point. Yeah.
But I mean, when you compare that to even the first 100 days of the Trump administration.
Well, let me just say this. When people say that the worst Obama scandal during his presidency was him wearing a tan coat, that kind of seems like ridiculous to me.
Yeah, and of course, in 8 years of a presidency, there's always going to be, scandals within the administration. But I think you'd be hard pressed to argue just on an ethical perspective, fidelity to your family, etc.
Oh, yeah.
And then also stability. I think, when Barack Obama took office, we were on the brink of Great Depression. I mean, I think the employment rate was 8 or 9% and climbing rapidly.
Unemployment rate, yeah.
And I think the Obama administration did a lot of things to sort of stabilize the country domestically. I mean, the stimulus, the bailout, whatever you think of that, and I have some issues with that. And I think part of that is just Obama's temperament in some ways, kind of having a steady hand. And I forget where I was going with this. I was just praising my boy over there.
See, look, the Obama love has, just resurfaced. But you were talking about, I made the point about how the the culture of conflict in American society was what colored the 2016 election, basically gave us a government of chaos, like kind of as a result of that.
I think that's true, but I think also some of it is due to the actual actors running the government in terms of the chaos. But I don't want to sound too partisan. I mean, I think you're right. The atmosphere of partisanship and I guess normalization of chaos certainly predated in some ways the administration of Donald Trump. But if it's all right with you, John, can we just jump a little bit into the news? Because this last week,
whatever dangerous territory you want to traverse, man. I'm willing to go there.
Well, it's pretty fascinating, and I think we don't talk a lot about, obviously, within Better Angels or within the news coverage writ large, because I think so much of it is just focused on the latest daily Trump thing. But this area of foreign policy and how it affects Americans, and how it affects our standing in the world. So I'd just be curious to get your overall take on the war in Syria, which obviously began several years ago, and the Obama administration had a policy that was polarizing even to his own administration. And continuing on through the Trump administration, then culminating this week in sort of this just abrupt decision by the president to say, you know, we've beaten ISIS, basically to just call victory and go home. And obviously it's an issue that has scrambled political allegiances.
Oh, boy.
And then, of course, you know, probably was the straw that broke the camel's back for Mattis. So what was just your take when you read that, and just your take on sort of military adventurism within the context of the legacy of Iraq and obviously the humanitarian crisis? What is our role in the world as, you know, some would say a policeman, others would say a moral beacon. I'm rambling here, but Syria.
What do I think of Syria? What does John Wood Jr. think of Syria?
Yeah, the people want to know.
The people are probably going to disappoint the people. I mean, that you're hitting me at my area that's probably weakest, really, and that's just my confidence and my understanding of the sort of the geopolitical landscape and, you know, the dynamics of our influencing our involvement in Syria and much of the Middle East in general. But having said that, in general, I'm not disposed towards military adventurism. I probably still think that the Iraq war was a mistake. However, having said that, I also think that pulling out of Iraq when we did probably opened the door for a lot of human loss and a lot of human carnage.
Well, and the rise of ISIS.
And the rise of ISIS.
Came out of Iraq.
Exactly. And so it's interesting to me to see the politics flipping, because I think that there's a good principled argument you can make to say, look, we need to still be in Syria. But it's just interesting to me to see folks on the left, like on MSNBC and so forth, really hammering Donald Trump for pulling out of Syria when they're all in favor of, you know, generally in favor of Obama pulling out of Iraq. Just in the same way it bothered me to see Republicans at the time, you know, back at this time when I was debating Maxine Waters a few years ago, just hammering Obama for wanting to take military action along lines of rationale that didn't seem materially dissimilar to me than the logic that many of these same Republicans supported in boosting the Iraq war under George W. Bush years before. So I don't know. It seems like what strikes me is just how other people's politics shift depending on what party is or politician is making the decision at the time. So, you know, it's plenty of it is over my head, but I guess that's just what strikes me about the politics. I don't know. Do you feel that way?
Yeah, no, I mean, I do think, like you said, a lot of times partisan considerations come into play in terms of people's foreign policy views on both the right and the left. I mean, I remember on the Obama campaign, Mitt Romney said, I believe, he described Russia as our greatest geopolitical foe. Yeah. And we just hammered him. You know, I think we said, you know, you're stuck in the Cold War. I think Obama said, you know, hey, Mitt, your foreign policy is calling you.
Yeah, he said I think he said something like the 80s is calling. They want their foreign policy back.
Yeah, that's what it was. Zing. That was a great debate for us. We're covered from the first debate, which was a disaster.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think, you know,
for Mitt.
Democrats.
I like Mitt. I still like Mitt.
Democrats miss Willard Romney, as he's officially known.
Well, he's back, though.
He's back.
He's in the Senate, man.
He's back.
Man, this could still be the age of Romney. People listening to this
yeah.
are probably not all that excited about some folks, maybe. Some folks probably are.
But so just to jump back in Syria before we belabor it, because I think we should talk about the shutdown, too.
Okay, yeah.
I think Syria and Iraq are kind of fundamentally different. I think people kind of loop them together because I think, the two primary justifications for the Iraq War, one, that they had weapons of mass destruction, and two, that there was a direct link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. Right. Both of those were proven demonstrably false. And the argument that Saddam was a direct threat to us, beyond his violations of human rights in terms of how he gassed the Kurds and all that nasty business, I think did not amount to a direct threat to the United States. Whereas in Syria,
I'd agree.
You had ISIS basically taking over the country. And I just think Syria is interesting because it's so complicated. I mean, you have Iran supporting Assad, you have Russia supporting Assad, Hezbollah as a proxy for Iran, and then you have the Saudis and the Sunnis supporting these elements that are fighting Assad but aren't quite ISIS. Yeah. And then we have the Kurds, who have been our allies for a long time, who are also fighting ISIS and who are a very effective fighting force. And then they have Turkey, who is looking for an excuse to basically attack the Kurds. And so I think a lot of the concern about us pulling out is in some ways abandoning our allies, because the Western force in Syria obviously includes France and the UK, and then also abandoning the Kurds and also kind of ceding the country in some ways, at least in terms of influence, to Russia and Iran, both of which are our geopolitical foes in some ways. Although I think the whole Iran relationship between Iran and the United States is really interesting, and I think it's obviously much more complicated than you hear from the administration and members of Congress, which is just Iran. Iran is our enemy. So, and I think it's always a little dangerous to kind of just announce we're pulling out. We won, we're pulling out. Yeah,
well, you're speaking for, I think you're speaking for, both sides of the aisle right now, at least as far as not just the Washington establishment goes, but even, most of the influential conservative commentators, I think, would make the same case that you're making right now, that, Syria is obviously it's a hotbed of violence and instability as it stands, but without any sort of an American presence there, you have the risk of just a massive conflagration that even goes beyond what it is you've discussed. I mean, if what I've heard, part of what I've heard talked about and anticipated is the fact that if you take an American presence out of Syria and you wind up having the sort of further destabilization that would ensue, that's going to put massive immigration pressure on Europe, for instance, as people flee the region and wind up going into, Britain.
Well,
and
I think
France
that's already happened.
So forth. It has already happened, but it would be greatly accelerated, I think, if there wasn't a mediating American presence there, and that contributes to a lot of the internal political instability that we see, because obviously Europe is going through similar things as we're going through, in terms of their internal issues with nationalism and immigration and all of those sorts of things.
Totally.
So it's just to say that it looks like Trump may have just pulled a domino piece out really kind of recklessly that might sort of trigger a much broader cascading effect. And to your point about Iraq and Syria being different, I would agree that, at least in retrospect, the reasons for going into Iraq and Syria may not entirely be comparable, but I think you could probably argue that the reasons for staying in Iraq and Syria might be a little bit more comparable. Yeah,
definitely.
So you mentioned the shutdown.
Shutdown.
The shutdown.
Shut it down.
Shut it down. Shut it down. Yeah.
You know that song by Drake and the Dream, "Shut It Down"?
I don't know that song.
One of his lesser known songs.
Drake and
I like the Dream a lot. Anyway.
Okay.
An aside.
You're probably a bigger Drake guy than
Yeah, man, Drake's a muse.
Yeah, right. So I'm more of a
shout out Drake. Come on the podcast.
There you go. I'm more of an old school hip hop.
No, me
person
too.
To the point,
me too.
To the extent that, of course, we'll have to just jump into a music conversation one of these days.
We got to rap on the podcast.
Okay, yeah. See, a lot of people don't know about our hip hop alter egos. So,
that's true.
We'll spring it on. We'll spring it on the folks gradually, perhaps.
Yeah.
We both got an eclectic sort of musical background here.
Right.
But the shutdown thing has been remarkable. This isn't the first time, in my memory anyway, that we've had a contentious, standoff over a potential government shutdown. I mean, the last one I remember
seems to happen every few months.
Yeah, well, and that's a bad sign, right? I mean,
right.
it was happening more and more under Obama and Boehner when he was leading the House. John Boehner, now the face of the American marijuana industry.
Is that true?
Heck yeah, it's true.
Oh man,
that's not a commercial, man.
I always had kind of a soft spot for Boehner, even though some of the things he did I found enraging. But speaking of a character, just chain smoking cigarette. Drinking Merlot.
I heard that Paul Ryan had to replace all the carpets and drapes and stuff in the speakers.
Let's get into Paul Ryan in a bit too.
Okay, let's just make sure we're watching the time here before they kick us out.
Yeah, and the news. I mean, who knows what's happened this morning?
Yeah, I know, right? Okay, so what were your thoughts on the shutdown? The shutdown threat. I was struck by the fact that Trump very boldly said in that public meeting with him and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Mike Pence, although Pence was only there physically.
Mike Pence, man,
he was as silent as a statue in that meeting. I kept wishing he'd say something and introduce a modicum of composure to that meeting.
I think he's just biding his time.
Don't get conspiratorial, bro.
Right? No, of course not.
But yeah, I mean, Trump very forthrightly owned the idea that he would be willing to shut down the government over border security, and promptly thereafter, I guess, agreed to sign a continuing resolution that would provide no funding for a border wall. So he changed his mind, and then Republicans and conservatives across the country, and in the House of Representatives in particular, got royally pissed, right?
Well,
royally upset.
And in the right-wing media environment specifically, Ann Coulter basically said
that she wouldn't vote for Trump.
She said you're abandoning your voters. I think Trump unfollowed her.
He did. He unfollowed her on Twitter.
Zing.
Ouch. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it was his signature campaign promise. So of course, people who voted for that would be upset. And but then Trump walked back his walk back and said that no, okay, I am willing to shut down the government over this. And now we have a standoff, and I think that it is symbolic of the dysfunction in in a very interesting and obvious way that I don't hear too many people remarking upon, and that's the fact that it's not just that we're shutting down the government. It's that we're shutting down the government over a $5 billion expenditure, which in the context of, the annual budget of the federal government is like a nickel.
Is that true?
Well, I mean, think about it. How
$5 billion is a lot of money.
The federal government spends closer to, it's been a little while since I've studied the figures day by day, so maybe this has increased, but the federal government spends closer to $3 trillion a year. So that's either total government spending or it's federal spending in particular.
Right. I'm not sure.
But either way, gets up to about $3 trillion. So it's just to say that $5 billion is a very small amount. But what the resistance to it indicates is the fact that the wall, it's not about the money, right?
Right.
It's about the symbolism of what the wall seems to represent. I'd be curious about your own personal feelings about this if you'd be willing to share it. Because for me, I'll just tell you how I feel. I've always considered, well, not always, but since I became more conservative, I've always considered myself to be a person who's just, if I feel conservative about anything, it's probably immigration, or at least it's one of the things that I feel more conservative about. And I do think that we should have a secure border. I don't know that a wall is necessary to do it, but I'm not in principle opposed to a wall if it worked. right? I think that we ought to look at our internal policies to see how it is we might not be attracting illegal or undocumented immigration. I think that, as a constitutional matter, I sort of feel like the 14th Amendment has been misunderstood for a long time, that birthright citizenship, I question the constitutionality of that, I would favor an immigration policy that puts more of an emphasis on people's sort of professional and vocational skills and so forth and what they bring into the country economically above simply having a familial connection. Although I wouldn't want to eliminate that, but I would want to reprioritize it because I think that we should be thinking about the needs of our domestic economy and obviously our current citizens, et cetera. The one area where I depart, I guess, from a conservative orthodoxy is that I'd never had any problem with, in fact, supported the idea of a path to citizenship for people who are already here. And that's largely on humane grounds. But I still understand the desire to fix the border. So the wall doesn't, I don't know if I believe in the wall, but it doesn't offend me. I do want something that works. But for you, coming from a more blue sort of perspective, do you have a different sort of emotional reaction to the idea of a wall being built on the southern border?
I'd make a couple points. One is I think Democrats over the past few years have supported increased border security as part of a bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform that would essentially pair increased funding for border security with a pathway to citizenship and what had been sort of common sense, at least insofar as they were understood by the center of both parties, to be a path forward on the issue. And I think that still stands. I think in terms of the wall, I do think a lot of people on the left have a visceral reaction to it because, well, I think most immigration experts have said it's not actually a sensible or financially responsible way to increase border security. There are better ways to do it.
It could be.
That's one thing on the pragmatic perspective. But also I think it's hard to divorce the rhetorical support for the wall from some of this rhetoric that comes off more racist or at least racialized in terms of how it's been presented by the president and a lot of his supporters. I think, when you hear Trump talk about the wall, it's very much, it's dehumanizing in some respects. I think if you look at some of the language that he's used, talking about immigration as an invasion or an infestation, or, talking about just, these are violent people. There's some bad hombres, I think, as Trump said. So I do think it's become a wedge issue. And I think, just politically speaking, which I guess is a little bit cynical, I don't think it's actually that great of an issue for Trump as he thinks. I think his core base is actually not enough for him to just win re-election. I think he also got a lot of support from suburban Republicans and people who held their nose and voted for Trump or secretly voted for Trump.
White Republican women, right?
Oh yeah,
who voted in higher numbers, and they maybe voted for Republicans at the midterms. I think.
Yeah, and I think from a political perspective, I think Democrats are happy for Trump to shut down the government over the wall because they feel like they just won an election that was sort of a repudiation of Trumpism. Right. And so I think they want to stand by, and I think if the government does get shut down, the blame is going to fall on Trump, and it's going to piss off most people except for these really core supporters.
Right. Well, so I see all that, and I do see the negative symbolism of the wall as having extended from the tone of demonization and demagoguery and so forth towards particular groups of people that Trump is seen as, and I think with quite a bit of justification, as having sort of perpetrated towards different groups like Mexicans, Muslims, etc. People see the wall as an extension of that rhetoric. So I think you're speaking to my basic suspicion, which is that it's not just practical opposition. There may be a practical argument to be made against the necessity of the wall, and I'm open to those arguments. But it is beyond that a sense that if we build the wall, it represents a fundamental alteration in the character of the United States. And so I understand that, and I can certainly empathize with that feeling.
Yeah,
but
and
on
I think
the other hand,
symbolism is important.
The symbolism is important, but I would also empathize with those who feel that. And again, remember where we started the conversation. We talked about this vast number of Americans who feel forgotten and left behind by the political elites, the academic elites, the cultural, and probably the technological elites too, and so forth. The wall to them is what they're yearning for is a symbol, I guess, of American sovereignty and so forth. To say that, you know, even if they feel like that they don't have much else, they do have the country itself, that this is their country, and that this wall is there to indicate the fact that people can't just sort of come in here and, you know, it sounds crass to say it this way, but to take what they genuinely feel is theirs, at least not outside of a justifiable legal process, right?
Right.
Look, I'm going to tell you a true story. It may not seem to be super related, but I promise you it is. I live in a fairly small place, duplex in South LA, right? And I got a neighbor. And my neighbor, he's always got friends coming over and so forth, which is fine, doesn't bother me. But my wife was in the back replacing the rotors on a van yesterday. My wife is a soldier and a mechanic, and you know she fixes everything, and me, I talk and I cook and I clean and so forth.
Shouts Triana.
Shout out to Triana. The gender roles are sort of reversed in terms of some of the stereotypes there. I can't screw in a light bulb. But one of my neighbor's friends. So we've got a wall in the back between us and the alley behind us.
A picket fence.
Yeah. Well, not a picket fence.
No,
it's
not
actually
a picket
wall.
fence. Excuse me. What is it? White. What's the white fence? What's the traditional?
Well, no, there would be a white picket fence, but we have an actual brick wall,
gotcha.
behind us, with a garage gate. And one of my neighbor's friends jumped over the wall. Doesn't live there or anything. He was just coming to see my neighbor. Jumped over the wall. While
It's a violation.
Yeah, while Mrs. Wood was working on the car, right? And I wasn't out there, but it ticked her off. And I don't blame her for being mad about it. He doesn't live here.
Right.
You know, he may have a friend here. But it's like, bro, you don't live here. You can just jump over our wall, you know?
Right.
And so, you know, that's a microcosm, but like when she told me that, I was mad about it. And so, you know, that's part of the psychological sort of thing here going on. It's just people just, you know, when you had, and we don't need to go too deep into this, but I had a lot of sympathy for the caravan, people who were, you know, migrating here from South and Central America. Was it South America as well, or was it
primarily Honduras?
Primarily Honduras,
and I think El Salvador.
Okay,
I mean, I think they're really fleeing.
Right.
You know, unspeakable violence to make you just take this incredibly grueling trek with your child.
Children,
I mean,
and so forth. Right. Absolutely. And so, you know, I just can't countenance speaking about people like that in disparaging terms. But I did see an image in that rubbed me the wrong way, and that was the fact that I saw some folks in that caravan. And again, I'm not trying to criticize any of these poor people in disparaging terms, but there are some people who are like flying Honduran flags or flying flags of their, you know, of their native country in that group that was marching up to the U.S.-Mexico border with the expectation that they would be let into the United States. It's like we have our own flag, you know? And that rubbed me the wrong way. And if it rubbed me the wrong way, it definitely rubbed a lot of other Americans a whole lot worse than it rubbed me. Because to me, it seemed like there was a sense that, you know, not only do we expect you guys to let us in, but we expect you guys to let us in as we wave the flags of our home country, indicating the fact that we are not American, maybe not trying to be American, but we expect to benefit from American largesse or what have you.
Right.
And so it's become governance and politics, to a certain extent, it is always this, right? But in a very dysfunctional way, it's become a war of symbols. But let me leave you with something inspiring about this, because I've got a lot of great friends, I'm blessed, including yourself. But one of my very best friends in life is a guy who one a guy who he and I know each other from the gym originally, boxing. We were, sparring partners and so forth.
I've seen you on the bag.
Oh, yeah. This guy, he's a great boxer, great kick fighter and so forth. My buddy Jose. Jose's Mexican. His parents came here, I think, without documentation. But they've built a landscaping business. Jose's grown up in this country. He's been educated, he's gotten a degree in horticulture and botany, and he's launching his own business. I mean, he's making his family proud. And his family, basically, is just a quintessential sort of American story. And these are folks who came here from Mexico without documentation. Anyway, Jose's just had a baby. He and his wife just had a baby. And I went over to his parents' place for the party after the baby was born. And his mother, who didn't speak a lot of English, she pulled my attention towards a sort of like a plant that they had. And it had a couple of flags in it. And one was a Mexican flag and the other was an American flag. And she said, I'm trying to remember, I think the Spanish word for grandson is nieto. She said something to me along the lines of, she said, mira aquí, right? Look over here. And she said, mi nieto, she said, es un mexicano, see, is Mexican, right?
Right.
Pero él es un americano también. He is an American as well.
Right.
And what she was saying to me in Spanish was that this is why we have the flags flying, side by side, the American flag and the Mexican flag, right?
It's a beautiful image.
Well, it is. And, I was one of the only non-Mexicans at the party, I think. And so, I think she felt it was important to show that to me. But I was moved by it. And I think that the vast majority of Americans, and certainly the vast majority of conservatives, would also be moved by that as well. I think that most people who have a sense that American immigration has all the wrong priorities and so forth really are people who at the same time would say, look, if you really want to be a part of the family and the fabric of this nation and sort of like celebrate, American heritage and so forth, you can also still bring your own culture and have it be a part of that,
Yeah.
And so I think part of what I wish we could see from our leadership is more, rather than saying immigrants are doing all these terrible things and so forth, and we need to sort of like, we need to put up a wall, keep people out, whatever. Make the practical points about how we fix an immigration problem, but also say that this needs to be a nation that nevertheless holds true to its roots as a melting pot and a refuge for those who are oppressed and persecuted and underprivileged around the world, who also seek opportunity and freedom and so forth within the American tradition and within the American heritage, to come here and to experience some of the opportunities that we have. There needs to be an inclusive tone in our politics in general, and as a red, I'd say within the conservative movement in particular, that makes us want to come towards symbols of unity as opposed to just sort of symbols of division and so forth. And I think that basic principle is one that we want to apply to left and right as well.
Totally. And I think you can be and are becoming a leader who can do that both within the conservative movement and the United States of America. I think to your point about...
don't put too much of that pressure on me, man.
No pressure, man.
I'm just a podcaster right now.
Yeah, well, starts with a podcast.
I got big hopes for you too, buddy.
Thank you. Yeah. We'll see. I don't know about that. But to your point about, I guess, what is sort of assimilation, I think American immigration does have sort of a history of that. I mean, if you compare how...
A rough history, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I spent some time in France, and you look at a lot of the dynamics around immigration in Europe, and you don't really have the sort of assimilation that you see in the United States. I think a lot of the people who come here from Mexico do want to assume Americanism as part of their identity and, remain faithful to American ideals and sort of not have these kind of separate encampments. I think I can see why the image of, folks flying a different country's flag and trying to come into the country could provoke some... just a feeling of this doesn't feel quite right, and we should think about this. But I think there's a larger dynamic in terms of left versus right as it reflects universalism versus particularism. I think there's a strain on the left, particularly among young people, that just sort of rejects nationalism as well as capitalism. I mean, there's the sort of abolish ICE movement, which I think is kind of a symbolic, rhetorical way of expressing your opposition to restrictionism and what people in that movement would describe as racism, sort of irrespective of what the practical implications of that are. And it can be tough when you have these more, I don't want to say extreme, but just, take no prisoners attitudes on both the left and the right, because they're never going to be able to find common ground, and these divisions are not going to go away. And it's sad because the people who end up getting hurt are the immigrants, I think, a lot of times, who are fleeing persecution and then come here and just are facing a lot of backlash, and sometimes families will be separated.
Yeah, I think they have a right to know what to expect too,
right,
when they approach America with the aspiration of immigrating and assimilating potentially into this country. The uncertainty isn't fair to Americans, and it isn't fair to people who are trying to become Americans or even just live in the United States. I mean, we probably don't have time to get into a long legislative history of this, but I think if we were to look at it, what we would see is that both under George W. Bush and under Barack Obama, I believe that there have been moments where we could have come to a reasonable compromise on immigration reform that would have done dignity and justice in general to American citizens and to put into immigrants and aspiring immigrants and so forth alike. It wouldn't have been a perfect solution on either side, but I think that the partisan back and forth, whether it was from conservative Republicans in Congress under Bush, or I would argue under liberal legislators under Obama, I think that, and you and I would probably argue a little bit about the specifics,
I would say on that.
But I think that in general, the unwillingness to come to a productive compromise because of the preeminence of cultural and partisan, pre-commitments has kept us from being able to actually help people when we could have, and to me, that's the big tragedy of this. So I'm just putting that out as a general statement. And I know that,
No, I certainly take your larger point. I think on that issue, a lot of blues would argue that we did sort of have the environment for a bipartisan compromise. I think you had the Gang of Eight and people like Marco Rubio, and then they were facing a lot of opposition from Rush Limbaugh and talk radio and
and I think what I'm thinking of in that context is, and that's definitely true. And of course, Rubio had to run away from that policy when he ran for president. But I also seem to recall, really, I think President Obama himself and others on the Democratic side, not Chuck Schumer to his credit, and not some of the other Democrats in the Gang of Eight, maybe Dick Durbin may have been one of them, but I think a number wanted to see a more sort of explicit or blanket sort of conferral of citizenship, or what we sometimes call amnesty and so forth. I think a lot of them thought that the package that Rubio and Schumer were putting forward was too conservative, but honestly would have been a hell of a lot better than the status quo we have now. And so that's just the point that I'm
it's well taken.
Yeah. So yeah, man, I think we've run around the world a little bit.
Yes, sir.
This is sort of our first episode of the relaunched Better Angels podcast.
I know.
With Ciaran O'Connor and John Wood Jr. I'm excited about this, man.
I'm excited too, and I'm excited to get some guests.
Yeah, totally.
So Maxine Waters, we'd love to have you on.
Absolutely, Congresswoman. That'd be fun.
President Trump.
Oh, yeah.
Open invitation.
Open invitation to Trump. Maybe we get Trump and Maxine on the podcast.
That would be great.
We could build that bridge. I think everything else will come in place.
Well, I can see why a lot of people on the left really like Maxine Waters, and I have a bit of a soft spot for her just insofar as she sticks to her guns. I think sometimes she'll definitely say things that are polarizing. I can see why people didn't like it when she was like, go harass Republicans,
the advocacy of public harassment of political opponents is not quite in keeping with our higher democratic ideals, I think. But
totally. Well, there's different ways of looking at it. I think activists would say sometimes you do have to ruffle some feathers. But I do agree.
I think Trump supporters would say that too.
Oh, they would, and that's why be
Feathers
interesting
are-
to have
Feathers are being ruffled, my friend.
Congresswoman Waters and Mr. President Trump on together. But no, seriously, we're gonna have a lot of guests.
And ways for listeners
come on.
and ways for listeners to get involved too, I think. So
Totally.
And members
I mean,
and so
Better
forth.
Angels is a citizens movement,
that's right.
and we're just here to, channel that to some extent. And we encourage people to start their own podcasts. I think the format of a liberal and a conservative coming on, not just to have a crossfire style debate, but get into some of these deeper philosophical and cultural issues and look for, not just points of common ground, but sort of reframing in a potentially transcendent and transformative way, I think is useful and also hopeful to circle back to hope and change.
I think a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on the idea of coming to common ground, but I think recognizing the ways in which we are arriving at common ground, but I think recognizing the ways in which we start with some common aspirations, even if we take different paths to
and we don't want to paper over our disagreements. I mean, I think it's helpful to talk about your disagreements and to clarify them because they are real and people are strongly ideologically divided. We are divided in this country, but that does not mean that we can't talk to each other in a respectful, empathetic, and ultimately constructive way.
Well, because I want a good life for you, and I think you want a good life for me.
I do.
Right.
There you go. That's a good way of putting it.
There you go. Well, I think that ought to wrap it up for us, man. But look forward, folks, to more of the Better Angels podcast. And like Ciaran said, we're going to have some great guests, and check out Better Angels. Become a member if you're not a member yet, because this is a growing space. It's a growing movement, the Depolarization Movement. And at this time in American history, you're going to want to be a part of it. So until next time, peace and blessings, everybody.
Peace.
John and Ciaran, out.